So where is the problem with Nestorius if he said something about the hypostasis and the Cyril didn't like that and called him a heretic or this sort of stuff? That's what we need to find. Okay, it doesn't say anything about Nestorius here that we can see. Oh, here we go. Nestorius suggested an even less creditable motive about Cyril. Right? Cyril entered into the dispute in order to divert attention from accusations against himself. And there is certainly some evidence pointing that way. Maybe we have to go back a bit. Where is it here? Nestorius became unhappily implicated. It would appear that he was personally quite opposed to the term and suggested replacing it by Christotokos, in the Greek, bearer of Christ, saying Mary did not bear the Godhead, she bore a man who was the organ of the Godhead. But this compromise was not of much help in easing matters, and he eventually yielded so far as to allow the use of the title Theotokos, provided that its popular implication were not unduly pressed. Had the controversy been purely local, it might have died down and done no lasting harm. But Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria, took it upon himself to interfere. His motives have been much discussed. It may be that he was genuinely convinced that the term Theotokos had to be defended if the full deity of Christ were to be maintained. The word had been used by Athanasius and possibly by Origen, and was regarded as a defence against Unitarian tendencies, but less disinterested motives were certainly present. He was jealous for the power of his see and of himself, and was anxious that Constantinople should be influenced by Alexandria rather than by Antioch. He probably also saw the dispute as a challenge from Antiochian Christology to Alexandrian Christology, and he may have thought that successful interference would establish the ascendancy of the See of Alexandria over both Antioch and Constantinople, thus helping to maintain Alexandria against the rapidly increasing prestige of Rome. Nestorius suggested an even less creditable motive, that Cyril entered into the dispute in order to divert attention from accusations against himself, and there is certainly some evidence pointing that way. But whatever the motives may have been, Cyril did interfere. He prepared his way with care, fostering enmity or dislike against Nestorius by agents in Constantinople, and taking steps to gain Celestine, Bishop of Rome, onto his own side. Rome was probably to some extent inclined to side with Cyril rather than with Nestorius, owing to the fact that Nestorius had received at Constantinople some Pelagians who had been banished from Rome. Eventually Cyril was able to persuade the Pope to condemn Nestorius, which was done at a synod at Rome on August 11th, 1430. A letter was drawn up notifying Nestorius that unless he recanted within 10 days he would be regarded as excommunicated. They must have had a connection to that church at that time. This letter was entrusted to Cyril to deliver, but before forwarding it, Cyril held a synod at Alexandria and condemned Nestorius in similar terms to those used at Rome, adding 12 anathemas, which are quoted in full by Geister Ecclesiastical History, issue, or probably page 397 to 398. Which Nestorius was to accept within 10 days of being excommunicated. The very first of these anathemas shows the way in which the rejection of the term Theotokos was assumed by Cyril to imply a questioning of the deity of Christ, and so to be contrary to the creed of Nicaea. If anyone does not confess Emmanuel to be truly God, and the Holy Virgin therefore the bearer of God, Theotokos, for she bore according to the flesh which had become the Word, Logos of God, let him be accursed. Meanwhile, Nestorius had not been inactive. He saw the way events were tending, and knew that nothing but his downfall would satisfy Cyril. He therefore took a step which he hoped would save himself. To avoid the excommunications sent from Rome and Alexandria, he besought the Emperor Theodosius II, who was still favourable to him, to call an ecumenical council to investigate the whole matter. Probably just sorted out. The Emperor agreed to do so and issued an order accordingly, which was dated November 19th, 430, thus proceeding by a narrow but sufficient margin the delivery to Nestorius of the communications from Rome and Alexandria, which were received on December 6, 430. The ecumenical council was called for Whit Sunday, June 7, 431, and was to meet at Ephesus. The proceedings reflected unfavourably on all concerned. The Syrian bishops, under the leadership of John of Antioch, arrived more than a fortnight late, and the Roman legates still later. Maybe they didn't really want to be there. Cyril, meanwhile, had insisted on the council being opened. The Emperor's commissioner, Count Candidian, protested in vain, and the proceedings began. Nestorius refused to appear before so unrepresentative an assembly, consisting for the most part of Egyptian partisans of Cyril. He was therefore condemned in absentia, for not being there. A condemnation received in Ephesus with tumultuous approval. Memnon, the bishop of Ephesus, being favourable to Cyril, so he's on Cyril's side, right? He's well liked by Cyril. He well liked Cyril. Buddy, right? When the Assyrians arrived, however, they at once joined with Nestorius in holding a rival council, at which they in turn deposed Cyril and Memnon. But when the Roman legates arrived, they sided with Cyril, so they were turncoats, right? Theodosius, acquainted with this unseemly impasse, appointed a second commissioner, Count John, who cut the Gordian knot by confirming all three depositions, that of Nestorius by the Alexandrian section of the council, and that of Cyril and Memnon by the Syrian section. Nestorius was sent back to monastery of Euprepius, which just over 3 years earlier had witnessed his glorious departure for Constantinople. There he remained, no longer a figure of consequence, for the next 4 years. Cyril and Memnon fared better, probably owing to Cyril's skill in gaining friends at court and elsewhere by intrigue and bribery. So he became more popular, probably better off financially, because he baffled them with brilliance and had a few bribes going on. Cyril soon escaped from custody and returned to Alexandria, where he resumed his episcopate as though no deposition had been pronounced. He had evidently been able to gain the favour of the emperor and of the emperor's elder sister Pulcheria, whose influence was considerable. A little later, Memnon was allowed to resume his office at Ephesus. As to the doctrinal problems, nothing had really been settled at the Council of Ephesus, or rather at the two-party councils, and so forth. Cyril proceeded by intrigue and bribery to force the Antiochians to come to an understanding with him. Probably come on his side, right? For they continued to hold Nestorius in esteem and regarded Cyril's 12 anathemas as heretical. But Cyril's methods eventually triumphed, and in 433 Alexandrians and Antiochians made their peace. The terms were that the Antiochians should acknowledge the validity of Cyril's section of the council, at any rate as regards the anathematizing of Nestorius, though Cyril's 12 anathemas were not specifically endorsed, and that the Alexandrians should accept an Antiochian confession of faith, and so forth. So the influence of Nestorius was thus completely ended in the schools of Antioch, which had formerly regarded him with pride. And although he was now disowned by the great majority of his original supporters, the Syrian bishops, the position which he had represented was by no means altogether forsaken. Many of the teachers in the important theological school at Edessa were still attached to the doctrinal system of Theodore of Mopsuestia, and approved neither of the events which had taken place at the Council of Ephesus nor of the discreditable way in which peace had been arranged between Cyril and John. Then it came about that the next scenes in the fortunes of Nestorianism were set at Edessa. But before passing on to Edessa, it may be desirable to complete the personal history of Nestorius himself. There is not much to relate. Soon after his banishment to Oasis, he was captured by Blemis, marauding nomads. Blemis. They released him, evidently near Panopolis, and so forth. And then eventually he dies at a place unknown, at a date unfixed, whose brief episcopate at Constantinople precipitated events which placed his name forever on the pages of history. Chapter 2, Transition to Persia. Although Nestorius was banished, the ideas which he had represented were not left without exponents. As had already been indicated, there was a strong element favourable to Nestorian views at the theological school at Edessa. The attitude of the school is of particular significance because most of the clergy for the churches of Persia received their training. They were trained at Edessa in Roman territory rather than in Persia, owing to the frequency and severity of the Persian persecutions at this period or in this period. Okay, we're jumping ahead. Okay, Nestorianism had long been evident in Persia. The Persian government had opposed Christianity partly because it was the religion of their national rivals, the Romans. But now that Nestorianism had been condemned and Nestorians were seeking refuge in Persia, there was no longer any danger that such a form of Christianity would be a link with an alien power. Yeah, they didn't like the Romans. Maybe they had a battle with them historically. On the contrary, it would be politically wise to encourage Nestorianism among Persian Christians so as to alienate them from Christians in the Roman Empire. This was accordingly done, and King Peroz, 457 to 484, gave up persecuting the Christians, except for a persecution in 465. But as this was directed against those who wished to remain in communion with the Church of the Roman Empire, it acted more as a stimulus to Nestorianism than as a deterrent from Christianity. Indeed, it is said that Barsumas himself took an active part in this persecution, telling Peroz that it would be best for the Persian authorities if all Persian Christians were made to accept Nestorianism. Nevertheless, it was some time before the Persian Church became formally Nestorian. The Persian churches, separated from the greater part of Christendom, both by national frontiers and by language, had almost inevitably come to regard themselves as a unity and had begun to look for leadership within their own country rather than in faraway Antioch, in which patriarchate they were reckoned. And here's more history there. The Nestorian Church in the time of Babai, 497 to 502. His teaching was quite definitely Nestorian, as is evidenced by his extant poems and sermons. He left no doubt as to the fount of Nestorian theology, describing Theodorus, Theodore, and Nestorius as the three doctors. He vigorously defended the reputation of Nestorius and ascribed his downfall to the bribery resorted to by his enemies, notably Cyril. Persian Empire. By far the greater number of the churches in the Nestorian Patriarchate were situated in and near the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, that is, in the western part of the Persian Empire. In this region the churches were well organized. The Patriarch of Ctesiphon, having under him a number of metropolitans who supervised the bishops of the towns and villages in the provinces. The Patriarchate of the East map, 500 AD. Arabia. Outside the Persian Empire, the churches in the Patriarchate were fewer and weaker, and information about them is more scanty and uncertain. But it is agreed that the Christianity had gained entrance to Arabia by this time. One of the most important modes of entrance had been by immigration of Christians from Persia in times of persecution, particularly during the latter part of the reign of Shapur II, 310 to 379, who severely persecuted the Persian Church from about 339 onwards. By the 5th century there were therefore many Christians in the southern half of the Arabian Peninsula. And looks like the extent of Christianity in India at the beginning of the 6th century is rather difficult to determine, although some modern writers are to be found who think even St Thomas the Apostle may have visited India. Most ancient references must be received with caution, not only because the writers may have been quoting on doubtful evidence, but also because the name India was very loosely used, being sometimes applied even to Arabia, Felix, or Ethiopia. It is also possible that after some centuries a confusion arose between St Thomas the Apostle and Thomas of Jerusalem, Thomas Cananeo, who quite probably visited southwest India in the 4th century. The persistent Thomas tradition in India may therefore be a genuine one, but its basis of reality may be the work of Thomas of Jerusalem rather than that of the Apostle. So these out there saying, yeah, Thomas went there, set up these churches, may have been totally incorrect, or maybe totally incorrect. But it is safe to say that there were certainly some Christian communities in India at this time, and an indication of their locations may be gathered from the writings of Cosma in the Coplustes, who wrote about 530. He says there were bishops at Kalyana, near Bombay, in Malabar, in the islands of Ciudadeva, Ceylon, and in the islands of Taprobana in the Indian Ocean, and that there were Christians in Pegu, the Ganges Valley, Konkan, China, Siam, and Tonkin. He definitely states that they were ecclesiastically dependent upon Persia, so what Christians there may have been in these regions must be reckoned as Nestorians from the 6th century. Turkestan. Persian Christian missionaries had begun to make converts among the Ephathalite Huns and the Turks in the neighbourhood of the Oxus, but no great impression had been made so early as 497. And they went to China. It is doubtful whether there were any Christian communities in China so early as AD 500. Christian influences, perhaps mainly through Gnostic and Manichaean channels, had already affected Chinese thought to some small extent. and there may have been sporadic missionary effort even so early as AD 300. But the founding of Christian churches did not take place, at least on any effective scale, till the Nestorian missionary expansion of the 7th and 8th centuries. The Nestorian Church under the Sassanids. The Sassanid dynasty continued in power and was on the whole tolerant. This was because it was recognized that the church in Persia was alienated from the church of the Roman Empire. They kept themselves away from them. They had no part in them with them. And it was considered more prudent to make Christians within the Persian Empire feel secure within their national boundaries, rather than to encourage them to look to their co-religionists across the border. The status conferred upon Persian Christians by Yazdegerd I, on page 46, was therefore generally respected. Nevertheless, there was occasional persecution. This usually arose at times when there was tension or war between the Roman and Persian empires. In such circumstances, as the conflict was between any empire avowedly Christian and an empire officially Zoroastrian, it's Persian, right? Zoroastrianism, Mazdaism, was the dominant religion of Persia from about the 8th century BC until the fall of the Sassanid dynasty in AD 651. It is named after Zoroaster, whose date is very uncertain, but who may have flourished about 1000 BC. Zoroaster established a religious system based on the old Iranian folk religion, but formulating it as a definite dualism. The supreme power of good is Ahura Mazda, later contracted to Umazd, and the supreme power of evil is Riemann. The moral and ethical tone of the religion is a high one, the teaching being embodied in the sacred book, the Avesta. The erroneous idea that Zoroastrians were fire worshippers arose from the large place occupied by fire in the sacred symbolism. The priesthood was restricted to the members of an exclusive caste known as the Magians. So that would be those Magi that came from the east to find the infant Christ, the Messiah, right? This was a period of actual warfare. Let's talk about a persecution in the reign of Chosroes I, 531 to 579, and coincided with the time during which he was at war with the Roman Empire, 540 to 545. Among the victims of this persecution was the good patriarch Abba I, that means master, or Lord Abba I. He was arrested and imprisoned, offered his freedom if he would promise to make no more converts. He refused and was in prison for a while longer, and he got hard treatment, so it caused his death, though he lived to be 552, 7 years. Okay. Apart from that, this Chosroes I seems to be quite tolerant. And then another outbreak occurred towards the end of his reign, and continues that Chosroes history. And continues history about Persia. Fortunately for the inhabitants of Persia, most of them belonged to faiths which were treated by Muslims with special tolerance. According to the teaching of Muhammad, as recorded in the Quran, leniency was to be shown to Jews and Christians on the ground that they were the people of the book, the Bible, or Scripture, and to that extent had reverence for the true God. Although no mention is made of them in the Quran, in practice the same tolerance was extended toward Zoroastrians, presumably because the Avesta was regarded as a book similar to the Bible, and Ahura Mazda was identified with Allah, the one God. Little difference therefore was shown by the Arabs in the treatment of the two religions, Christianity and Zoroastrianism. Nevertheless, the effect of the change of government was much more adversely felt by the Zoroastrians. This was because Zoroastrianism had owed so much of its influence to its standing as the national faith. That prestige was now gone, and it steadily declined as a live force of Persia. Indeed, it almost disappeared altogether from Persia, and today the only Persian Zoroastrians are a few families in Kerman and the oasis of Yezd. The residue of the faithful immigrated to India, where the descendants, now known as Parsis, maintain the Zoroastrian faith. They number about 94,000 and are to be found mostly in the Bombay Presidency. In doctrine, they have tended away from the original dualism toward monotheism.